Hey everyone, welcome to today's exploration into the world of Middle-earth. Let's kick things off by looking at Sauron's earliest days, back when he was known as Myron, a Maia spirit of impressive talent and devotion. If you've dived into the Silmarillion, you might remember how these powerful beings served the Valar, each adopting different skills and purposes. Myron's knack for creating and organizing made him stand out, especially under the guidance of the Vala Aulë the smith. In those ancient times, Myron's heart wasn't bent on evil. He genuinely loved structure and perfection, wanting to shape the world in a neat, balanced way. Tolkien mentions in his letters how these Maiar often had deep admiration for their Vala masters, and Myron was no different. He drank in every lesson Aulë had to offer, from forging metals to understanding the intricacies of Middle-earth's raw materials. But Myron's passion for order slowly turned into something much darker. He began seeing flaws everywhere he looked, and wanted absolute control to fix them. This shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in quietly as he became more obsessed with bending the world to his will. Though still under A's wing, there were whispers among the Maiar that Myron's drive for perfection was getting out of hand. By the time he crossed paths with Morgoth, Myron's desire for dominance was already forming. He still had that hunger for creation, but now there was a twist of arrogance growing within him. In the Silmarillion, we see that Sauron, originally Myron, wasn't just any Maia. He had the talent and ambition to become a major force. Little did he know that this path would lead him to become one of the darkest figures in Middle-earth's long history. Let me know if you have any thoughts so far in the comments. Were you aware of Myron's original place under Uí, or did you always picture him as the Dark Lord we see later on? I'd love to read your insights. The Corruption by Morgoth. If you're ready, let's keep going and talk about the influence of Morgoth on Myron's future. When Morgoth, once known as Melkor, first set his sights on Myron, it wasn't a random meeting. Morgoth looked for individuals who already had a spark of ambition, those who could be swayed to see him as the ultimate source of authority. Myron, with his growing obsession for control and order, fit that mold perfectly. Tolkien often emphasizes that Morgoth had a knack for identifying insecurities and desires in others, then twisting them to serve his own ends. At first, Myron saw Morgoth's power and thought it could help bring his visions of a perfectly structured world to life. In The Silmarillion, it's clear that Morgoth rarely appeared as an outright villain to those he wanted to recruit. He knew how to flatter and promise just enough to lead his followers down darker paths. Myron's thirst for power and perfection found a mentor who promised him unlimited potential, and that was too tempting to ignore. Slowly, Myron's loyalty shifted. He might have started out merely curious about Morgoth's grand claims, but the more he listened, the more those claims turned into convictions. Morgoth taught him to see others not as equals, but as lesser beings to be ruled or used. If Myron questioned these harsh methods at first, he soon pushed aside any doubts, dazzled by the strength of Morgoth's will. By the time Myron fully embraced Morgoth's influence, he had all but discarded his old name and purpose. The notion of serving I became a memory, replaced by the lure of domination. Morgoth had effectively planted a seed of total control in Myron's heart, and that seed grew into a dark resolve. He learned how to bend minds, instill fear, and exploit weaknesses, skills that would later define him as Sauron, Morgoth's most notorious lieutenant. Even after Morgoth's defeat, the impact of that twisted mentorship remained. It shaped the way Sauron approached every challenge, every alliance, and every enemy. Morgoth's biggest gift to him, in a grim sense, was the mindset that nothing mattered more than imposing one's will upon the world. That lesson stuck, and it would drive Sauron to claim the title of Dark Lord for himself one day. The Rings of Power and the One Ring. Sauron's hunger for power took a sharp turn when he set out to create the Rings of Power. In The Silmarillion and Tolkien's letters, we read that he approached the Elves of Eregion in a fair guise, calling himself Annatar, or Lord of Gifts. This was an intentional move. He knew the elves possessed immense skill and knowledge, and if he could lead them to craft mighty rings, he could eventually bind them and everyone else to his will. The elves, particularly Cel-Bimor, were intrigued by Annatar's teachings. He showed them new techniques and secrets of forging that they hadn't considered before, always hinting there was something greater to discover. What the elves didn't know was that Sauron's ultimate aim was to create a master ring, one that would dominate all the others. Tolkien mentions that Sauron's words were honeyed lies, cloaked in promises of enhancing Middle-earth, protecting it from the shadows, and even delaying decay. Once the rings were forged, Sauron moved in secret to craft the One Ring on his own, deep within the fires of Mount Doom. This ring wasn't just a powerful artifact, it was an extension of Sauron's very essence. He poured a large portion of his will and might into it, betting that if he could control the ring, he could control all who bore the other rings. This was the core of his plan, a hidden tether connecting every ring to him, like threads pulled by one puppet master. But the moment Sauron slipped the one ring onto his finger, the elves sensed his betrayal. They realized something foul was at play, and swiftly hid their own rings away. Despite this setback, Sauron's plan wasn't a total failure. He still possessed a formidable weapon, and he'd soon use it to sway men and dwarves, eventually setting his eyes on dominating all races of Middle-earth. Here, Tolkien paints a clear picture of Sauron's nature, relentless, cunning, and blinded by the idea that absolute power could solve all problems. From that point on, Sauron's fate became bound to the ring. The immense power it offered him was seductive, but it also meant his spirit and strength were partially tied to its continued existence. If the ring was ever destroyed, he would be undone. Yet, in his arrogance, Sauron refused to believe anyone could willfully destroy such power. That gamble, as the stories later show, would mark the beginning of his end. The fall of Númenor. One of the biggest turning points in Sauron's long history was his involvement with the mighty kingdom of Númenor. For a while, he had been growing stronger in Middle-earth, but he knew he couldn't challenge the Númenorians directly. They were too powerful at sea and had impressive armies. Instead, he let himself be taken as a captive, which was really part of his clever scheme to undermine the Númenorian court from the inside. Once in Númenor, Sauron quickly rose from prisoner to advisor, whispering twisted ideas into King Ar-Pharon's ear. The king was proud and feared his own mortality, dreading the fact that even he, with all his grandeur, would one day die. Sauron pounced on that fear, feeding Ar-Pharon's ego and hinting at secret knowledge that could grant everlasting life. Through flattery and half-truths, he convinced the king that the Valar were keeping immortality all to themselves. It didn't take long for Sauron to manipulate much of Númenor's noble class. He portrayed the Valar as jealous overlords and claimed that by defying them, mortals could claim their rightful place. He introduced the worship of Morgoth, leading many to abandon their old traditions. Even those who weren't fully convinced found themselves intimidated or swayed by the king's new policies, all guided by Sauron's dark counsel. The downfall came when Ar-Pharon, spurred on by Sauron's propaganda, decided to sail west and challenge the ban of the Valar. In a catastrophic moment, Númenor was swallowed by the sea, punished for its arrogance and disrespect. Sauron's physical form was also destroyed in that cataclysm, but his spirit survived. From then on, his hatred for the free peoples and his obsession with conquering them burned hotter than ever. Master of deception and fear. Beyond Númenor's downfall, Sauron's biggest weapon remained his mastery of deception. Even when he returned to Middle-earth in a weakened form, he knew how to prey on the hopes and fears of those around him. Whether it was promising protection to frightened villages or offering wealth and power to ambitious rulers, he always tailored his lies to fit the desires of his audience. This knack for manipulation proved to be just as crucial to his conquests as any army or fortress he commanded. He didn't rely solely on brute force unless absolutely necessary. Sauron preferred subtlety, sending out spies or cunning emissaries to win over hearts and minds before turning to open warfare. If a leader was proud, Sauron would flatter them. If they were anxious, he'd promise safety. If they were greedy, he'd whisper stories of hidden gold. Each person had a weak spot, and Sauron was disturbingly good at identifying and exploiting it. Even among his own ranks, Sauron kept his followers in line by skillfully balancing fear and hope. Orcs and trolls cowered at the mere thought of his wrath, but it was often his servants among men who were the most dangerous, as they believed they stood to gain real power. Tolkien highlights in his letters that Sauron understood the hearts of men too well, always zeroing in on their need for recognition, wealth, or eternal life. When the free peoples of Middle-earth finally realized the extent of his influence, they saw that his lies had woven through countless lands, stirring mistrust and division. Old alliances became strained, and neutral factions began to doubt the cause of good. This was classic Sauron at work, planting seeds of paranoia so that his enemies would unravel from within. For him, fear was as potent a weapon as any sword or spell. The final downfall. Despite this overwhelming manipulative presence, pockets of resistance still held firm. Characters like Gandalf, Elrond, and Galadriel urged others to stay united and not give in to fear. They understood that Sauron's power came from more than physical might. It sprang from the darkness he ignited in people's hearts. And that's exactly why standing against him wasn't just a matter of armies and battles. It was also a test of hope, loyalty, and trust in one another. Sauron's downfall really took shape when the Free Peoples formed new alliances to challenge his growing influence. In the books, it's clear that everyone recognized the One Ring's power had to be undone if they wanted to stand any chance at lasting peace. Despite Sauron's massive armies and fearsome Nazgûl, the heart of his strength lay in that single golden band. As long as it existed, he could keep reshaping his forces, rebuilding even after defeats. Though he suspected someone might try to use the ring against him, it never crossed his mind that anyone would willingly destroy it. His arrogance blinded him to the idea that a couple of hobbits, Frodo and Sam, would be the ones slipping into Mordor right under his nose. Tolkien shows us that while Sauron was busy mustering orcs and unleashing terror across Middle-earth, he didn't pay enough attention to the small, seemingly powerless folk who posed the greatest threat. When Frodo finally stood at the cracks of doom, the fate of the entire war hung in the balance. In that last crucial moment, the ring nearly won him over, seizing on his exhaustion and despair. But Gollum's sudden intervention caused the ring to tumble into the fire. It wasn't a grand, heroic strike, but a tragic twist, and it sealed Sauron's doom once and for all. The moment the ring hit the lava, Sauron's spirit was violently ripped from any chance of regaining true form. In that instant, the dark tower crumbled, the Nazgûl were swept away, and an era of fear came crashing down. Sauron's essence, bound to the ring for so long, dissolved into a shapeless shadow. Although evil wouldn't vanish entirely from Middle-earth, the immediate danger he posed was gone. Everywhere, from the ruins of Barad-dûr to the hearts of those who'd been under his influence, you could feel a sudden weight lift, proof that his iron grip had finally shattered. Reflections on Power and Corruption. Thought for a few seconds. Sauron's story isn't just about battles or magic rings. It's also a vivid warning about how quickly ambition conspires into corruption. Tolkien shows us a character who started off with noble intentions, fascinated by creation and order. Yet, in chasing perfection, Sauron lost sight of the very boundaries that gave his work meaning, eventually stepping over a line that dragged him into darkness. In the Silmarillion, we see how Myron, as he was first called, genuinely admired the harmony that Uwe and the other Valar strove to build. That admiration slowly twisted into a need to control everything around him. He began to believe that his own vision was the only right path, and that everyone else should be forced to follow it. What was once a love of order turned into a relentless drive for power. This transformation highlights one of Tolkien's recurring themes, the idea that even the most promising beings can fall if their desire for control goes unchecked. Sauron stopped caring about individual freedom, focusing only on bending the world to his design. That obsession damaged not just his spirit, but also the lives of countless others who found themselves under his rule. In the end, Sauron's downfall reveals a hard truth. Absolute power comes at the cost of one's own humanity, or in his case, his very essence. When a person, or a Maia, places ambition above empathy and cooperation, they risk being consumed by the very power they seek. Tolkien used Sauron's arc as a stark reminder that if the drive to dominate overshadows compassion and humility, it leads to destruction, both personal and far-reaching. The One Ring stands at the core of Sauron's power, but it also lays bare his deepest vulnerabilities. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien shows us that this small, unremarkable band of gold holds an enormous piece of Sauron's own will and spirit. Creating it was his way of binding all other rings of power and their bearers to himself. That desire to control others reveals just how far he was willing to go to achieve domination. Yet, the ring doesn't only corrupt those who wear it, it also cages its maker. Sauron poured so much of himself into the ring that if it were ever lost or destroyed, he would be left with nothing but the faintest echo of his former self. This gamble came from his arrogance. He couldn't imagine anyone willingly destroying a treasure with so much power. That blind spot, as we see, becomes the flaw that brings about his end. For those who come into contact with the ring, whether Frodo, Gollum, or even Gandalf, who fears to touch it, the struggle goes beyond physical possession. It digs into the bearer's soul, whispering promises of greatness, while slowly warping the mind and heart. In his letters, Tolkien points out that the ring magnifies the personality of its owner, making the good more noble if they resist it, or the weak more wicked if they give in. It's a direct reflection of one's inner resolve. Ultimately, the destruction of the ring marks more than just a military victory. It symbolizes the triumph of free will over subjugation and the importance of humility over pride. By casting it back into the very fires where it was forged, Middle-earth regains the chance to breathe without the looming threat of a single tyrannical master. The ring's fate is Sauron's fate, bound together until both crumble into ruin.